Hello.
Good evening, everyone. As people are coming in and settling in, I would like to welcome everyone, Hotep Peace Habarigani, on behalf of the New York Association of Black Psychologists. My name is Dr. Jamila Codrington, and I have the honor of facilitating with my co-moderator, Dr. Denise Hines-Zami, this really important conversation tonight. And we are bringing you an interdisciplinary panel on policing in Black communities. And we are doing so in the spirit of Kwanzaa. So I know it may feel a little bit early. It is a pre-Kwanzaa celebration, and it is a virtual gathering. So as you settle in, please put yourselves on mute. We will be inviting you to share reflections, thoughts, questions that you have throughout the evening in the chat, and then we will engage with them during our community forum part of the program. Our panel will be a 90-minute experience where we'll have a series of perspectives on this very important topic, and you'll meet the panelists in a little bit. And then we will have a 30-minute Kwanzaa celebration. I do want to let everyone know that the event is being recorded, and it will be posted on the New York ABSI website so that attendees can go back and review or share, or those that may have missed it can also experience it. And we are also going to be gifting you a resource list. So at the close of the event, we will email attendees who have registered a resource list that has some important links for additional reading or movies or content that would center yourselves inside of the dialogue. And lastly, I would like to just introduce one of our past presidents and elders of the New York Association of Black Psychologists, Dr. Lisa Witten, and she will take us through our virtual libation.
Good evening. We pour libation to honor our ancestors and to demonstrate that there's a connection between those who have made their transition, the living, and those not yet born. It allows us to let our ancestors know that we remember them, we acknowledge the sacrifices that they made, and that we recognize that since they live in the spirit world, they know more than we do because they can see in the dark. This is a practice, a ritual that's practiced throughout the African diaspora. It's an African cultural retention or an Africanism. Many of us are aware that even in our neighborhoods, brothers on the corner who are sharing a drink together often pour a libation and say, this is for the brothers that ain't here, or this is for the brothers who are upstate. This demonstrates that despite the efforts and the damaging strategies that people use to try to disconnect us from our culture, make us ashamed of our culture, that we have managed to retain our culture and develop our pride in our culture. So we call upon the ancestors to be with us and share their wisdom and help us as we deliberate on these very important topics. I will call the name or invoke the spirit of an ancestor, and the response is Ashe. Ashe is a Yoruba word meaning let it be so or let it be done. So I will start by calling the names of some of our ABSI ancestors, and then if you'd like, you can unmute your mic and call upon the names, call upon the spirits of some of your ancestors or some of our shared ancestors. I pour in the African American tradition, and I pour with water because water is cool and water knows no enemies. I'm pouring into a plant as if I'm pouring into the earth. I call upon the spirit of William Lyle, one of our past presidents and one of the people who is known as the father of Black psychology in New York. Ashe.
Ashe.
I call upon the spirit of Vera Pastor, one of the early members of the Association of Black Psychologists, New York chapter. Ashe. I call upon the spirit of Asa Hilliard.
Ashe.
I call upon the spirit, moving now to our shared ancestors, of Ida B. Wells Barnett. Now you can call the names of any ancestors you'd like to, whose spirit you'd like to invoke so that they are here with us tonight.
I invoke the spirit of Francis Cress Welsing.
Ashe.
Malcolm X,
Ashe.
Ashe.
Alvin Adams,
Ashe.
Tina Comer,
Ashe.
Mary
Hazel Monica Warren.
Bethune,
Zuhari Chen de Rosier,
Ashe.
Ashe,
Paulette Victorine,
Ashe,
Ashe Nicholas.
Ashe.
Fannie Lou Hamer.
Ashe,
Tamir Rice.
Ashe,
George Floyd,
Ashe,
Sandra Bland.
Ashe,
And Kamalika Williams.
Ashe,
Amadou Diallo.
Ashe,
Anthony Baez,
Ashe.
Dr. David Terrell.
Ashe.
Ashe,
Philando Castile.
Ashe.
Ashe,
Bruce By.
Freddie Gray.
Ashe.
Dr. Shango Johnson.
Ashe.
Okay.
Walter Kenneth
John Martin.
Hines.
Ashe.
Ashe,
Eric Garner.
Ashe.
Ashe,
Taylor,
Ashe.
Martin Luther King Jr.,
Ashe.
Ashe,
Malcolm X,
Ashe,
Ashe,
Marcus Garvey,
Ashe.
Ashe, Marcus Garvey Jr.,
Ashe.
Ashe, Ashe, Ashe. Let it be so.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Witten. Thank you to the community for participating in a remembrance of our individual, our collective ancestors, and all of those who have been slain in the wake of police brutality and violence and the larger oppression of Black bodies. So this virtual gathering serves as our 2020 Kwanzaa celebration. And of course, it's taking place in the last few days of the year. And historically, it is a time for people of African descent to go through a sober assessment of where we stand individually, but more importantly, where we stand as a community. And to do a collective assessment and self-reflection, we need to be extremely clear about the process of recommitting to our highest cultural value. And there is no greater value than the need to live, the need to breathe, the need to be able to exercise our right to live while being Black. And oftentimes, historically, policing in Black communities has been a fundamental threat to these basic needs. So the intent of our dialogue this evening is to really have the courage and the candor to interrogate the problem of policing in Black communities. so that we can effectively move forward and take action. We want to think about this not from a polarizing conversation about good versus bad or defunding the police versus self-policing, which is really underdeveloped and unproductive. But rather, we want to ground ourselves in the highest expression of our cultural values, the ones given to us by Kwanzaa, the Nguzo Saba, like unity, self-determination, collective work and responsibility, creativity, and faith. And with a finely tuned interdisciplinary lens, we want to engage in real problem solving and healing. And so in an African-centered framework, we believe in the power of the expressive arts as a healing modality. And our stories of both trauma and pain, hope and resilience have historically been told through song, dance, spoken word, and so many cultural arts. So this evening, before we go any further, we want to frame the context of our discussion through a powerful protest song. Some of you may have heard it. It's by a 12-year-old boy from Florida named Kedron Bryant. And the lyrics of this song were actually written by his mother in the wake of the George Floyd killing. And when she heard George Floyd call out for his mother, she realized that the world needed healing and that she needed to give her son some wisdom to live and to fight this fight, which is not just the social justice fight, but it's a spiritual fight. So she meditated on it, she wrote the lyrics on paper, and she tasked him with going upstairs, praying over the words, meditating over the words, and then in his devotion time, writing, singing a song, coming up with a melody so that he could minister to the people and provide some encouragement. And this is what he came up with. So I'd like to invite everyone for a moment to just take a collective breath. Sometimes these images and the words can at times be triggering, but it is also a site of our resilience. It is a site of our artistic expression of protest. And as we move forward in this discussion and we think about those words of I just want to live, we want to center ourselves in our hashtag for the evening, which is we are done dying. Okay. I'd like to invite my co-facilitator, Dr. Denise Hines-Zami, to introduce our esteemed panelists.
Thank you, Jamila. These are our panelists for today's discussion and community forum in policing in Black communities. Dr. Marva Dawkins is a Chicago-based clinical psychologist in the field of police and forensic psychology. Welcome. Dr. Charmaine Dodd is a New York-based clinical psychologist and member of the New York Association of Black Psychologists with a background in forensic psychology. Welcome. Franchon Francis is a North Carolina-based licensed clinical mental health counselor and certified trauma and resiliency trainer. Welcome. Dr. Gregory Mack is a New York-based clinical and forensic psychologist, as well as a retired NYPD detective and psychologist. Welcome. Curtis Stephen is a New York-based journalist who has written extensively on criminal justice reform. Welcome. Danielle Woods is a 20-year veteran with the Detroit Police Department who was recently assigned to the Chief's Neighborhood Liaison Unit and is a Detroit LGBTQ liaison officer. Welcome. Welcome to all of you. There are numerous perspectives on the problem of policing in Black communities. We have invited you here from different professional backgrounds and communities to consider a wide array of perspectives on this problem. So for our lightning round first question, in 1 minute, we'd like each of you to answer the following question. From your perspective and orientation, what is your summation of the problem of policing in Black communities? Dr. Dawkins.
I think it is fair that you start with me from the standpoint of having spent so many years in the field of police psychology. My perspective is exactly that. Black communities' perspective of policing is very different from police perspective of the Black community. And we'll talk more about that as we go on. So it's the perspective that each has of one another that has created tension.
Thank you. Dr. Dodd?
So from my perspective of the field of psychology, I see the issue as decontextualized historical, intergenerational, and societal trauma in both the bodies of police officers and the bodies of Black and Brown community members.
Thank you. Ms. Francis?
I actually just want to completely agree with Dr. Dodd. As a trauma specialist, basically trauma lives in the body. And what happens when police officers interact with people on both sides, the person that's being interacted with as a civilian and the officer, as their trauma and their fear increases, their intelligence level decreases. This is a scientific fact. So that is happening all the time across the country with all kinds of interactions. It's specifically horrible in communities of color because we struggle and we have generational trauma and we have all these other things coming into those references. So really all of the talk about we need to think and things like that, that intellectual functioning is so low that we're going on instinct based on fear. And that's overall the problem of why we continue to die.
Thank you. Dr. Mack?
Good evening. Shortly after Michael Brown and Eric Gardner were killed, President Obama basically formed a task force and they made a publication, Task Force on 21st Century Policing. And in that writing, they basically identified 6 main points for revision. And one of the most important pillars that they identified was the issue of trust and legitimacy within on the side of the police officers and within the community. As trauma specialists are aware, when you are faced with different traumas, trust is one of the hallmark issues that become challenged. The ability to trust. There's a problem called moral injury that is very much tied to post-traumatic stress disorder. The moral injury on the part of the officers, on the part of the community, just echoing what other psychologists have just said, we are all traumatized. The officers that serve our community are traumatized. The community is traumatized. Being able to form trust with people that look like us and that don't look like us is a challenge. In addition to that, the officer's mental health is a problem. With the number of police suicides that we're all aware of, we start to realize there's problems afoot that need our help.
Thank you. Mr. Stephen.
Thank you for having me. Good evening to everybody on this panel. Good evening or good afternoon or good morning whenever you watch this if you're not here with us. And I just want to say I appreciate the manner with which this session began, because similarly, I want to echo those sentiments and say to those who have lost someone due to violence in any form, we also acknowledge you, because of course the scars of that pain never leave, really. So those who are walking around with that trauma, we see you and we acknowledge you. Of course, all of us here tonight are speaking or tuning in from wherever we are. And of course, for me here in New York City, by reporting on the NYPD, I'm sure much of that will resonate with those who are in other parts of the country. So I'll just say in terms of numbers, when we look at statistics and where things are in terms of the NYPD, I tend to focus on this, which is the amount of dollars that the city makes settlement claims every year with the NYPD and members of the public. And last year, that figure, and this is for cases of excessive force, property damage, obviously just discourteousness, whatever, in all of its forms of abuse that's taken place. Last year, the total figure was $220.1 million of total settlements. In 2018, that was $237 million. So that's a 7% decrease. But obviously, as you can see, we're in that $200 million range of settlements that the NYPD has had to make with members of the public due to, again, excessive force, civil rights violations of the sort. So what are the problems of policing in our neighborhoods? It's in the numbers.
Thank you. Liaison Woods.
If you can off your mute.
Okay,
Liaison.
my
Thank you.
apologies. My apologies. I was muted and didn't know. I would just like to first thank you for this opportunity and this platform to have this conversation. And I echo, and please forgive my head and don't blame my heart. I can't remember the gentleman's name that spoke on trust. I think that is a monumental issue within the Black community as far as policing, just the history in and of itself of how policing even came about and what policing has become today. And I can't even say the new perception, because it seems to be this heightened wave of police brutality and injustice. So I would definitely say it's all about trust. It's based on trust. That's my issue, or my response to what the problem is trust.
Thank you.
And thank you to all the panelists. We are now going to engage in a deep dive. And I want to jump off with this understanding that the narrative of controlling Black bodies as a method of maintaining the status quo, of carrying out the agenda of racism and oppression is not new, right? So it's been around for centuries. It's a long-standing narrative. And so we want to begin the deep dive by really contextualizing the conversation in history. And we can't talk about policing in Black communities in an ahistorical way. So I'd like to direct this question to Curtis Stephen. What is important to know about the history of policing Black bodies?
You're muted.
I'm muted. I'm not muted anymore. I'm learning Zoom. Thank you for that, Jamila. And I'll take that question. I'll also just acknowledge a mentor of mine who I see, and Ron Howell, who, again, a wonderful journalist who broke a number of stories on the NYPD as well. So I would not be on this panel or report on these stories were it not for him. So just want to acknowledge that. As we all clearly know, our history and anything that involves us goes back, right? So obviously we can go back to 1619 if we want on all of these questions. I won't obviously tonight for purposes of time, as I lose my lighting there, for purposes of time, but just for some more modern context, we can go back certainly through the 20th century. And I'll just for perspective's sake say that, you know, I reported on stop and frisk during the Bloomberg era, right? And I've reported on any number of wrongful conviction cases, which usually emanates obviously with a wrongful arrest. So that's sort of the continuum of dealing with that. And obviously with the numbers I gave before, those are issues of, again, abuse cases, wrongful strip searches, just things that we don't typically hear about in and beyond the sort of fatal incidents that sort of take place. But this is the big takeaway I had. I recently did a story for City Limits magazine here in New York, or City Limits Online, and it looked at the history of the efforts to have a civilian complaint review board. And although one exists here in New York, the issues of trying to get that in a more rigorous state. And really the undercurrent of that has been our role. When I say our role, our people's role, right? The civil rights community in raising racism and excesses of policing in our neighborhoods, particularly, as a steady stream. In other words, the two times that I noticed that the NYPD has had a public reckoning and has had to face itself has been over corruption. It was the Knapp Commission in 1972 and the Mullen Commission in the early 90s. That was really the only times in the public sphere that the NYPD has been forced to sort of issue widespreading, issued massive reports and really had to confront how it does its business. The one time where the effort to raise race and policing, and I can have Ron Howell check me on this if I'm incorrect, but in terms of my research, the late Congressman John Conyers, along with Charles Rangel and the late Congressman Major Owens, they tried in about 1983 to do a wide-ranging series of panels and a wide-ranging investigation on racism in the NYPD. This was in 1983. That was not allowed to go forward. They had a hearing and it pretty much blew itself up with protests and the like that took place. I think it's quite striking that it's been that long ago since that issue was raised and that hadn't actually gotten itself to play itself out, unfortunately. So where are we today, obviously now, right? In the aftermath of George Floyd, in the aftermath of Breonna Taylor, cases that have not even been resolved, right? So it feels strange to say in the aftermath of, but just in terms of protests that we've seen, the biggest issue right now is obviously, and we'll talk about reform later, but just what's been the undercurrent consistently back in the 1960s. I've looked at it. The Police Benevolence Association was resistant to reform back then. It remains resistant to a wide series of reforms, both those that have been implemented and those that are being suggested to really bring about sustainable reform. So we'll look at that later, but those are some of the big takeaways I have at the moment.
Thank you. This next question is directed to Danielle Woods. What are the elements of police culture that have allowed violence to continue in Black communities?
Okay, so we had a conversation about this question, and I'm not biased in responding to it. However, to say that police culture allows for violence in the Black community is, I guess, that's one of those. I'm having a hard time grasping that. I know from a societal perspective, they view us as this big organization, this brotherhood, or we have this code, this thin blue line, and I definitely understand, because before anything, I am a Black woman, so I understand the hurt our community is feeling. And so in becoming a police officer, I made it my business to create change from the inside. I think that this has a foundational type of, I want to say, a learned behavior, because we're trained, right? And coming in, you have to have certain morals and ethics within yourself, even signing up. And so if those things are lacking, and then you have this machismo, if you will, here comes the abuse of power, and the misuse of your power, and the badge. But then you also have sometimes people that don't understand the people that they're policing, and so then that then creates a situation in and of itself. So the overall purpose of police is to promote public safety and uphold the rule of law, so that people's individual liberties may flourish. But when you have officers that again misuse and abuse their power, this creates the mistrust, and takes their faith and hope in the people that are supposed to protect them into a negative space. So I think that the perception of the misuse of the badge and abuse of it is a contributing factor to the violence. And there's a difference between, within the organization and standing with your sisters and brothers in blue versus the criminality and disrespect of the badge. That is a issue across America, with police departments, and some officers not speaking up for whatever reason they deem is valid for them not to speak up regarding the abuse of power and criminality behind the badge. Is disheartening, but I can't speak for other departments. I can only speak for Detroit, and we have a zero tolerance when it comes to that, and different ways and levels of reporting criminality amongst the ranks. So I'm never claiming perfection ever, but I think that the perception our citizens have is not as heightened in a negative sense as some cities. Again, I'm not claiming perfection, but we have a relationship with our community and with our citizens that helps to create or build on a trust that we're working so hard to maintain. But that element, that abuse and misuse of the badge, and the lack of understanding the people that you're supposed to serve and protect is lost.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Liaison Woods. I want to echo something that you shared that I think is important, which is that there's a bit of a duality, right? That law enforcement officers are who we are looking to for safety, right? To uphold public safety and for protection. But paradoxically, throughout most of our history, a lot of the institutions, the laws, the regulations, some of the policing behaviors, and the mindset has been a site of physical, emotional, and psychological harm for Black and Brown communities. So we want to now speak to that duality, particularly in a context of trauma. And I'm going to ask Francis to help us understand how does the history of trauma play out in Black communities when we are navigating the need to both protect ourselves and seek help from law enforcement. How do we navigate that duality given our trauma history?
Thank you. First, I want to start with just a little tiny education about trauma. I can tell that my other panelists obviously are well versed, but for those in the audience who aren't, we're dealing with three things in the Black community that come from different places, but exist within one individual Black person any given time at the same time. So the first thing is generational trauma, that both exist in our blood and in our DNA, that is passed down from generation to generation. Also, learned behavior and comments that are said. So those learned behaviors and comments that are said are things, for example, like, we don't call the cops, we don't tell people our business. Things that are said by our parents, our uncles, our aunts, things like that. So now we have a blood kind of line of mistrust, and then we have the learned behavior, the cognitive mistrust, and then we have our lived experiences, either that we've lived personally or that we've seen on television, or our uncle or cousin or somebody else has experienced in this generation, in this current time. So all the ways that we get information is telling us, do not trust the cops, do not call the cops. They are only here to hurt us. They're not going to handle the situation appropriately. Even though that may or may not necessarily be true in every circumstance, that is what happens. So then our attitude kind of shifts of, okay, do we need to figure out a way to handle it ourselves? And what does that look like? And how do we do that? So it's kind of confusing. And I believe in authenticity. There's a few of you on here that know me, so you'll know that I kind of say things. I'm the unpopular opinion kind of woman. So recently I was in a situation, unfortunately, where I was threatened. And I was talking to a friend about it. And the individual that threatened me is a Black male. And the friend that I was talking to is a white female. And I was telling her what happened, and she was like, oh my gosh, you need to get a restraining order. And I said, I live in Wilmington, North Carolina, and you want me to put a restraining order on a Black male? I don't think we're gonna do that. And she was like, okay, good point. I see your point. And not that I actually am friends with police officers locally that I have a great relationship with, but also we recently made CNN because 3 officers threatened to kill just Black civilians, and it was caught on the body cam. So both of those things kind of existing at the same time, that's how it plays out, is we are unsure of what to do and how to handle the situation, and we're trying to figure out a way to handle it ourselves. And we're also making some assumptions, because not all officers are going to come in and be lethal, but some are. And it's kind of like, do you take that gamble? Do you not take that gamble? And it's very difficult when your family and the people around you are kind of telling you what to do. And some of that is based on historical information, right? But then some of it is happening today in 2020. So it's definitely a complex situation, and we need to be mindful of that. I love that I keep hearing the word trust. I keep hearing the word safety, and then Liaison Woods brought up building relationships. I think that that is really important for all of us to keep in the forefront of our mind of how do we combat that. I think that's all I have for that.
Thank you. This next question is directed to Dr. Marva Dawkins and to Dr. Greg Mack. From a psychological perspective, how can police officers overcome implicit bias and anti-Blackness sentiments that contribute to disproportionate acts of brutality and violence in Black communities?
If it's okay, I'll start off addressing that. Again, I want to thank everyone for sharing in this forum and very important discussion. I started off talking about different perspectives. There is, of course, the historical aspect that someone has already spoken to, but the important thing to conceptualize is the notion that there is another side to the way people look at the problems of policing in the Black community, and that is the establishment. How do they perceive violence that they must confront in our communities? It is very similar to the historical perspective of keeping slaves in bondage. The ideas of laws back during slavery was, of course, to keep the slaves controlled and contained. Even after emancipation, even after we were given citizenship, the laws, primarily from the perspective of Blacks, were to keep us controlled and contained. So a lot of what we did was combated by people representing the law and law enforcement. Law enforcement developed in this country parallel to our Black people's perception of law enforcement. In other words, I'm trying to say that whites and immigrants, the white immigrants and settlers embrace law enforcement for their safety and protection. So law enforcement became one of our most, our noblest of institutions in this country, but not for Blacks, because it represented for us fear, being controlled, and endangerment, and becoming a part of the institution or systemic racism within our country. Okay, so law enforcement is part of the many institutions where racism sets in. Whites developed stereotypes about Blacks. The people who are selected going into law enforcement have been influenced for generations after generations by these stereotypes. So they already have a negative impression of African Americans. People who are selected into law enforcement have negative impression, and they're mostly whites, because Blacks have not seen law enforcement as something they really want to be a part of. And I hope I'm making a point here, okay? Law enforcement is a positive institution for whites, every ethnic group, and they have embraced it. So they have generations of people in law enforcement, their fathers, their fathers, their parents and uncles and so forth, right? But for African Americans, that's not true. There's another catch here that's important to take in consideration. African Americans, because of racism, because of institutional racism, we are disproportionately represented in everything that is bad in this country, and that includes having the most of us embedded in poverty in impoverished communities. So criminality has been associated with being blacks, well, with being black through stereotypes, particularly in reference to the black male. Implicit bias is the notion that we are the sum total of our ancestry, no matter where we come from. In America, that for whites has been the impression that blacks, particularly the black male, is a threat and a danger to everybody else. Unfortunately, because blacks are overrepresented in communities of poverty, when we get played out on the news time in and time out, then the rest of the country is reinforced that blacks are bad, so that crime is associated with these bad people, and therefore people who go into law enforcement and culture of law enforcement is then reinforced the notion that blacks are bad, they are criminals. Once you are able to dehumanize another human being, then you're able to do anything you want with that human being, and that's what's been happening to blacks in our communities. White people are not inherently bad. They simply have been victims of a sort of a system that has never worked for us on race relations in this country. I'm going to stop there because I think we're going to talk a lot about this in the discussion of how this is played out in our institutions. The worst place that it is played out is in law enforcement because of power and force. Selection of people, I think a couple of the panelists have already addressed that. Selection of people who should never be in law enforcement, and they're given the power to act out on all of these unconscious prejudice and racist views that they have, that black folks are inherently bad, and therefore it's all right to do whatever they want to in the name of keeping law and order.
Thank you. Dr. Mack?
It appears that the focus would be on fixing the racist or the anti-black police officer to fix the system. I think to fix the system, to fix the implicit, the institutionalized racism, we really need a wider focus to begin with. And that wider focus would include the black man, the black woman, and their self-esteem, their self-worth. I come from a family of police officers. My father was a police officer, started in '61, rose to the rank of sergeant. My older brother is a police officer. My younger brother is a police officer. I was a police officer. My son, who's 21, guess what he wants to be? A fireman. No, police officer. Why? Because from our perspective, police officers are noble servants. From our perspective, we are healers of the community. When I was a police officer in a mounted unit, I gave rides to kids that lived in the projects, in the areas that I patrolled. To them, I was a welcome sight. Yes. On my horse to give them rides. There was no police bias or anti-blackness that they got from there. I've worked with several white officers who are connected to people of color in very intimate ways. So also working as a psychologist with NYPD, I've worked on screening out police officers And as you know, that's just about impossible to do unless there's some red flags that are glaring. But overall, there is no way to psychologically screen out, at least that I'm aware of, to screen out the racist police officer, unless they're doing something that's very obvious. And so what can we do? Education, with becoming closer to the Black community comes education, comes knowledge. But again, I don't like so much focusing on white bias officers. I want to encourage any person of color that to fix police racism requires filling the numbers. The transit system used to be predominantly white, white employees. But by today's standards, it's predominantly Black. There's no reason why police forces can't have the same change. When you talk about a biased police force and you listen to who the union heads are backing, you get the sense that they don't necessarily care about racism. That's not their interest. They're interested in maintaining power. So having the right individuals in the right positions is how I view making fast, quick change, rather than looking at the decades and even centuries of racism that's been maintained up and until there's a changing of the police force. When the police force looks like the individuals that they're serving, these issues actually reduce. Are there police officers, Black officers, who are brutal and self-hating? Absolutely. But at the same time, the notion that becoming a police officer is something to be looked down upon is not a sentiment that I share, and I would argue just the opposite. To fix the
I hope that was not the message that I was conveying. Just the opposite.
No,
I
not at all.
concur with you 100% that if our communities existed a lot like far easier, if there were hundreds of families like yours in our communities, they would look a lot differently, who have embraced law enforcement proudly and with honor and serve in the communities. Our communities would look a lot different.
And even with that, there would need to be the education. And so I can't help but go back to the trauma, and the trauma affects safety, our sense of safety. It affects the officer's sense of safety, trust, our trust, their trust, power and control, esteem, intimacy. When there's domestic violence within the family and you ask the family members, is there violence? Is there anything wrong going on in the household? Do you know what they're going to say? They're going to say no. They're going to protect their family. They've been taught to deny that anything is wrong. And this is what happens in the police department.
Yes, I think as African Americans, our battle is a lot steeper, and that is, we have to figure a way of overcoming structural and systemic racism. It's not the individuals. Individuals are, by and large, Americans. They are good human beings, no matter what their ethnicity might be, by and large. Okay, there's bad people everywhere. But what we're confronted with, what we're faced with, is the acculturation that goes on within these institutions, and the acculturation that occurs within policing is probably more ingrained than in any other institution because it dates back all the way from the beginning of when the first slaves came over. Policing has been designed to keep us contained and controlled, and generation after generation, I think one of the panelists pointed that out, that's what we've been confronted with and trying to deal with.
Right, but relying on politicians to institute policies and procedures to change that
You said
institutionalized
exactly.
problem is one way, but also change from the inside.
Yes.
For example, when we talk about racism, as a PhD student at St. John's University, I had a professor tell me the only reason that I was accepted into the program was because I was Black. So we're talking about an institution where until I'm on the inside, I can't affect change to the institution. Being a part of the institution doesn't mean I'm signing on to that institutionalized process. It means that, and this has been a problem with Black leadership in terms of Black leadership within NYPD. Unfortunately, their voices have been very silent. They know the dangers of raising opposition. I can't tell you as a DEA member how many newsletters I got saying to vote for a particular party, and that party is being viewed as being racist. So there is an institutionalized racism. However, being a part of the institution allows you to start making cracks within, from within. Certainly,
most definitely,
working as an activist on the outside can generate some attention, but politics rule the day, and being on either extreme, unfortunately, fosters more resistance.
So I want to thank both Dr. Dawkins and Dr. Mack on really a spirited dialogue and jousting, if you will, around where does the role and responsibility come from. And it's not just within one sector, right? And in the spirit of self-determination, or Kujichagulia, one of our Kwanzaa principles, it's a call to action also to us as psychologists, right? Yes. Not just the system, not just the individuals who enter the system, but as Black psychologists, we have a cultural imperative, not just to address the mental health needs of our community, but also the issue around policing in Black communities and the racial injustices around it. So I want to ask now a particular question to several of the psychologists on the panel. What role can psychologists, and particularly Black psychologists, play in addressing the problems within this understanding of policing in Black communities? Dr. Charmaine Dodd, can you start us off?
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying my first interaction with policing and psychology actually happened when I had the great privilege to work under Dr. Dawkins at her practice and doing police testing there. And I became very fascinated, not with the police pre-employment screening side, which we were doing, but more so with what was happening between those initial screenings and hirings of officers and the first time they would come in for fitness for duty screenings. And I know that it was said earlier that we can't blame it on culture, and by no means do I think that all of the blame goes on police culture. But I do think that something crucial happens within those first 5 years for some officers that can be attributed to police culture. And something also happens in police departments where individuals who are serving as public safety officers are allowed to continue to engage in practices, criminal or otherwise, that would have them be brought back in for fitness for duty evaluations time and time again. Now, as a psychologist, I know if I were to engage in some sort of criminal or unethical behavior, I would have to answer to my local state's regulatory board, and my license would be in jeopardy. And that's something that would be on my record and is accessible to the general public. This is not the case for many public safety officers. You may not have any idea, unless this case becomes high profile and someone's digging into it, that this individual had actually been brought in for multiple fitness for duty evaluations based on behaviors that they were engaged in while serving as a police officer. And I think that that's something that we can do better in working with police departments and working with development of test materials and evaluation of test materials and conversations with law enforcement executives, and specifically Black law enforcement executives, of how to change that pattern that's happening. For example, I know my alma mater, John Jay College, recently put on, I believe it was over the summer, a 6-part series on the future of public safety. And they partnered with, I believe that it's called, I might screw this up, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, to be able to have these discussions, educate the public, and try to create solutions for change so that we can build up or reconstruct what policing looks like in New York and across the country. And I think that psychologists play a crucial role in that.
Thank you, Dr. Dodd. Dr. Dawkins, your perspective.
Well, I so appreciate Charmaine and the experience she had when she was here in Chicago. I'm pleased when students take away things that I never think that they are actually observing. But her point was well taken, that one of the things that we can do as psychologists is to be far more proactive than we have been, especially as Black psychologists. We are sophisticated enough in the field of psychology to be able to quantify human behavior. In other words, we can measure a lot of things about human beings. One of the things that's clearly lacking, and we know it's lacking, is in policing, people are dealing with people. Yet in training police officers, it is people that they are educated the least about. Take that a step further. They don't understand people. Policing is geared toward more the enforcement part of laws, enforcing the laws, not in the part of serving. People are just like you and me who decide to go into a career in law enforcement. So they're regular human beings, so to speak, but they are impacted by the experience. One of the things we Black psychologists sort of neglected that we probably could have had going for us 3-4 decades ago, and that is the idea of cultural competency. The idea that before people come into our communities, they should be competent to understand the people that they have been sent to police, serve, and protect. We fast forwarded 3 decades to where we are now, and the young men and women who are being selected by our police departments have no clue whatsoever about us as Black people. And what do? They base their relationships with people of the community on stereotypes, what they have been exposed to and taught about Blacks in the Black community. And as I was making the point before, that's mostly is negative stuff about us being criminals, especially in terms of the Black male. And unfortunately, when these young officers are exposed to the violence and crime that exist in our communities, because we can't ignore that, they leave with the impression that's reinforced that Black people are bad and they do commit crime and they do now require force in order to, back to slavery, in order to control and contain them. And we've come a 400-year cycle to a modern day version of what our ancestors went through.
Thank you, Dr. Dawkins. Dr. Mack, please share your perspective.
And so I'm sure a lot of us Black psychologists are familiar with the publication, Even the Rat Was White, the publication that addressed the use of psychological testing to screen out immigrants to maintain the status quo, to proffer the eugenics movement in the sterilization of ethnic minorities. So psychology has been a part of the problem from the very beginning, from a historical perspective. And just as it has been a part of the problem, it has always been a part of the solution.
Yes.
The inclusion of Black psychologists in that correction, in that education, has, well, I'd like to say there's room for more involvement. There's room for more involvement. There's room for, and as a psychologist, are we allowed to be politically active? I think when we imagine what a psychologist is or does, we are the blank slate, right? So we
Most
can't
definitely.
have opinions, or we're not supposed to be activists in any loud, glaring respect. At least that's the training. Maybe we need to be trained differently to learn how to be more of an activist. The quiet, solitude of the reflective professional, that image probably needs to be revised so that we can have more of a voice and an impact on some of these issues. Who among us will take that challenge? When we do, we become targets and we become leaders, and it jeopardizes our sense of safety. But to enact change in any real way, we can't continue to sit back in safety. There's risk-taking that needs to be done to have any real impact. And so, you know, I think once that movement takes hold, I think we'll have a stronger voice, and the movement can include some of the Black psychologists among the other activists who have taken up the mantle for equality.
Well, I believe that that's why the Association of Black Psychologists exists. We've taken it on. Thank you. This next question is directed to Daniel Woods and Dr. Marva Dawkins. How can we better bridge the divide between the police and the Black community?
I have thought of this one a lot. To bridge that divide will require a lot of effort on the part of African Americans. We can do a lot more than what we have been doing for the last 2 or 3 decades. For us old timers, so to speak, the door has opened again in 2020. And that door is, the establishment is beginning to listen and ask for the input. What can we do to make things different? How to change things? And given that, we should be very prepared to offer concrete ways to bridge the gap between, in this case, public safety and the Black communities. One of the most important ways, and as the doctor was explaining, is that we professionals must become more proactive in stating specific ways of change. For example, in policing, we should get involved in policy-making decisions impacting the lives of Black folks. We should get involved in the selection process of who becomes police officers. We should get involved into what they are being trained to do and how that training can have impact into our communities. We should be involved in the mental well-being, not just of the officers themselves, the police officers, but of the people that they are serving. We should be more proactive in setting up, as the gentleman was speaking, about the commissions to monitor the actions of police officers. Policing is not inherently bad. It is that the design of the establishment at this point has been against the interests and well-being of African Americans from a historical perspective. We have to get the white establishment to understand what that means and how that can be changed.
Thank you.
And there are many, many more ways. Everybody can contribute to this question.
Okay, so I believe I'm up. I talk about this often with my family and friends and also my partners. I think first, and I know it may be hard, but I think that people should understand that police officers are also people. We're not perfect. We don't go home and plug ourselves up at night and, you know, jump off the charger and come to work. We're also people. And with that understanding, just that, I'm not saying disregard everything that's going on. Just the, I guess, the human side of both parties. Now, the playing fields are not always even, specifically when we're called to intervene a situation. But our first order of business is to preserve life, okay, and protect and serve. And it is very disheartening at times when we encounter a parent and they have a child with them, and the first thing they say is, "You better be good or I'm going to have them arrest you." We needed to be taught that the police are there to help you, you know. And in that same process, I believe Dr. Dawkins mentioned it, get involved. It is imperative that as Black people, we understand our rights. We understand, you know, what is and what isn't a crime. And we also need to police ourselves. And that is a huge thing within the community. It's easy to do this. It's really hard to do this. And that's not placing blame on anyone. It's just saying, in growing in this together, we have to somewhat get on the same page. And with that understanding, we are human and doing what we're supposed to do as well. And being involved in creating spaces and platforms such as this to have these discussions. And don't let the conversation stop. Don't let it fade out. You know, you have to follow up with action. And we have several things in Detroit. You know, we have our Citizens Police Academy. We have our Citizens Radio Patrol. You know, we have things that we do with the children that get them involved and show them the human side of officers. And we work with our community. We talk to our community and not at our community, which in turn works in the favor and the betterment of building up community in the essence of bridging that gap, right? Closing that space where we're misunderstood. We've had a number of incidents, specifically this past summer, and in standing in those lines when protesters are, peacefully, you know, voicing their opinions, but when it's no longer peaceful and you're spitting at officers and throwing rocks, and I understand the anger and the frustration, but now it's no longer peaceful and it's viewed as now brutality when officers are enforcing the law. And so that's why it's important for us to understand, again, our rights and how to get our point across without putting ourselves in a position of injustice. If I can make that assessment, it's I can't believe in my 20 years I've never experienced the heightened situation of what we're dealing with now, just as a people. I've never experienced that, even as a kid and growing up on the far east side of Detroit and having a household that was functional yet very dysfunctional, with functioning parents that were drug addicts, and being the oldest of four and raising my siblings. So I'm no stranger to the struggles of our community and culture, if, you know, that is the topic of conversation. However, getting involved and making sure that my voice is heard and I'm at the table and going to community meetings and finding out from my community what they want from their police officers, and
Yes.
also community, you know, saying, hey, well, we want to do this, we want to do that. And I know too, even when we talk about bridging the divide, you know, police, we don't get commercial breaks in real life. We count on our community, and so it is imperative that we have that relationship. But so often, specifically in our community, we complain in our own silos, and it starts and stops there. And a lot of times we don't take action, and sometimes we don't take action in fear of retaliation or in fear of, you know, the what if, and that's very understood, but that doesn't help. And so I think that in understanding we're human, getting involved, knowing our rights, and how to create a better society and community for ourselves, and being involved, I think that that is a good start.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liaison Woods. First of all, for your service in the Detroit community, in doing the work, being of the community, and serving the community, and attempting to bring the concerns of the community to the Detroit Police Department. And thank you for sharing some of the initiatives that are happening in Detroit. You also mentioned that there comes a time where we have to not be passive in our response to fear, and not just be from a standpoint of complaining, and that sometimes we have to understand how to police ourselves, and that can be a resolve. I'd like to really speak to that and bring in this idea of how do we control crime in our own communities? What can we do as a alternative to looking at systemic changes and the site of reform being in the police department, but within how we manage our own communities. That's a strong perspective in this dialogue that exists. I'd like to address that question to Dr. Charmaine Dodd.
You're muted.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm actually quite excited to answer this question. And I think there's multiple factors to look at here. To kind of piggyback off of what Danielle Woods was saying, officers do not plug themselves back up when they go home. They're human beings. And I think that speaks to what Friend Sean was saying earlier, and Dr. Dawkins and Dr. Mack, about police officers being human beings and needing to address the inherent trauma that is the job, and not blowing that trauma through the individuals that they're serving, and having a mindset of being a guardian of the public rather than a warrior working against the public. And I think that's on the police side as police officers who are also members of the community. Let's not forget that. But within the Black community, I think there is so much more that can be done, especially kind of tying it to the principle of Kujichagulia, self-determination. You know, I think it is important for us to figure out what we can do for ourselves within our communities to make things better, and recognizing all of the issues that are occurring. Some great examples of that I've seen both in Chicago and New York are what's happening with violence interrupters and the Cure Violence program. I've worked very closely with violence interrupters on Staten Island with the True to Life program and the work that they've been doing in a part of the city that is very racially charged right now, Staten Island. But I also am always pleased to hear and get regular updates on what Erica Ford is doing with LifeCam and how that is serving the community, not in terms of just reducing crime and violence that's happening within the community, but also increasing the amount of resources that are made available to prevent that crime from occurring in the first place. I think we really have to look at it at all of those levels, not just, you know, as psychologists, how can we deal with the trauma that's occurring from individuals being exposed to all of these negative social determinants of mental health, right? Not only how can we treat the trauma after it's already happened, but what do we need to inject into our communities to resolve some of these issues that are leading to heightened criminality, increased violence, low socioeconomic status, low mental wellness. You know, we are considering ourselves to be in the healing profession as being psychologists. So healing is not just looking at the illness after it's happened, but preventing it from occurring in the first place.
Yes. Can I add to that? I think that was so powerful, because one part of that will be the ability for us to be able to network. If there are programs that are working successfully in Staten Island, then why can't we duplicate or replicate those programs in Chicago, in Miami, and in Houston, throughout the country? We finally have, not enough certainly, but we finally have representation, like people like yourself, Dr. Dodd, and other people here and there in playing significant roles. But what we are losing out on is that we are not connected. We have broken those ties. I've been continuing to do things in Chicago, and I lost contact with you almost a decade ago. And look how successful you've been in that regard. And just think what we could do with another generation, your generation. And then one other thought, and that is we must get the community to change their perception of policing. Every ethnic group in this country has embraced law enforcement as a means out. Once you go into law enforcement, you can get the least amount of education to go into a career with 2 years of college in most places, and then you become middle to upper income. You can buy your home. You have the status of the the uniform, you can make advancements within police department. This is a well-kept secret that we need to sell to our communities, that careers in law enforcement are wonderful, and perhaps we can stem the tide from going into criminal justice systems, into prisons and jails, into law enforcement. And just imagine if we were overrepresented in law enforcement the way we are overrepresented in criminal justice. But thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dawkins and Dr. Dodd.
Thank you.
My next question is, what action steps should we be taking to address the problem, Mr. Stephen, with regards to police reform? What action steps should we be taking?
Okay, right. I want to make sure I wasn't muted this time. So a lot of important themes have just been discussed. And I just thank you, Charmaine, for mentioning the name Erica Ford. I mean, just another unsung hero, somebody who I've interviewed over the years. I mean, Isha Sekou as well here in New York City. These are Black women who are on the ground, who are dealing with our young people and also with the police simultaneously. We need to duplicate these people as well, just as we are here, because it's also individuals as well. So on the issue of reform, and let me just mention this because it resonated as a point. You know, the New York City Police Department is the largest force, right, in the country, if not the world, of some 36,000 police officers, maybe just about 35,000 or so. And about half live in New York City itself. About half. That's according to the latest study. And of course, there's been a long running issue. In fact, some legislators are trying to work on a proposal to try to mandate to have officers as a requirement. That's been also an historical resonance, right? Because as folks are talking about this, right, how can you be something that you don't actually see, right? So just putting that out into the ether. As we talk about having progressive officers, if that is not your face, but you have a different face that's out there representing the institution, then that's just an academic exercise in a sense. You have to actually visualize to have that. So that's one issue. So the reform is on a macro level and a micro level, right? Let me just acknowledge, at least in New York City, what's taken place, because I think it mirrors an issue overall across the country. One of the reasons why I focused on civilian oversight in reporting on it is because in the aftermath of the protests over George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, that has been the traditional and standard and most current and most numerous reform effort that police, law enforcement agencies across the country have gone to, right? We need to set up a civilian complaint review board, right? If the one doesn't exist, or we need to revamp it. That is from whether it's Chattanooga, Tennessee, or wherever across the country. And it's interesting. I mean, there really are no studies as to how effective they are, right? So some of these boards are set up, but who's actually on the boards? What are they empowered to do? You know, I talked to a lot of, let's say, a younger generation, if you will, of activists who increasingly said that we're beyond the point of oversight, or this may resonate with some folks, overseeing. We want to get to a point of reimagining what the concept of policing is all about. And again, some of this has resonated with what you all have already talked about, but in terms of, for example, should police be responding to call A, right? In terms of this particular case. And there's the middle ground potentially, right? Because again, even the Police Benevolent Association, you may hear folks say, as conservative as they are, well, we don't want to have our officers responding to this particular case, right? So there may be some middle ground there, perhaps that folks may not realize in terms of working on things. But I'd just say the biggest reform effort that's taken place here in New York, I guess, has been transparency, right? So much of what the NYPD does is not known. It's in secret, right? It's not publicly available. For example, the numbers that I gave you earlier in terms of the settlement cases, and again, now the Civilian Complaint Review Board, there is a full database. And again, New York Civil Liberties Union and others have had to fight to create this database, by the way. This was against the EPA wanting this done, but now you can go online, type in an individual officer's name, and see their history in terms of cases that were filed against them. This is brand new, right? This has just been implemented. So the issue of transparency has improved somewhat in that area. But again, there's still a long way to go by way of reviewing certain things in terms of
Looks like we're having a little bit of technical difficulties with Stephen.
violence. Can you hear me?
There you go.
Okay.
You're back.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Well, this was my concluding point I was going to make. You know, I don't know if anyone here has heard the name James E. Davis. He was a fairly prominent police officer. He was actually assassinated in 2003 in City Hall. He became a city councilman. And I had one of the final interviews with him. And one of the things he said to me was that I need to do a story about alcoholism in the police department. I anticipated telling that to you all here, and I was going to say I have not unfortunately done that story, so I apologize to the late, great James E. Davis. But I think what he was getting to there was about taking a deeper dive on the psychological makeup of officers, right? What are they dealing with? So often it's been said that we ourselves as a community are often studied, but what is the, you know, not just our officers, what their psychological makeup is in terms of their abilities to do the job, but how are they doing the job and how do they feel about it and what's going on in their universe? Because there is a macro component to this, and we've talked about it, I'm sure, very well, but there's also that individual as well. That officer who has to go to the street corner, who's dealing with all of the stressors of being there with the baggage that he or she is carrying, who just trails off on a young person who's on the corner for no reason, or grabs that person and slams them against the wall. We can go macro, but there's also micro. Could that have been, what's the word, you know, caught early, right? Early warning, right? Early tracking. These are things that are also being discussed as well and should also be fleshed out further. So again, there's a lot of work to do, but certainly initiatives like this, I think, would certainly help.
Great.
And I just want to add to that, Curtis, with what you're saying about reform, and it needs to include the body, right? When we think about all the changes that you mentioned, for example, what comes to mind for me is the Minneapolis Police Department. Those officers are some of the most trained. They have been trained in procedural justice. They do implicit bias training. You know, they are some of the most well-trained officers in the departments in the United States. And George Floyd was still killed. And I think what was missing is that component of the individual trauma of the officers and focusing on the police body and making sure that they have the proper treatment to continue to go out there and do the job.
I so agree.
I want to thank Curtis Stephen and Dr. Dodd for those reflections, because it is a perfect segue to this next question that focuses on the healing that needs to take place within the police department, right? So racism and oppression affects us all. Liaison Woods talked about the fact that she's a Black woman before she is a police officer. And there are a number of ways in which police officers are dealing with the same exposure to the violence and the brutality that exists. And they respond to it in different ways. So I'd like to direct this question to Liaison Woods and to ask you to really help us understand, from your perspective, what does healing look like for law enforcement officers?
So
what should it look like?
I have been toiling over this question since you sent it to me. And I wish I had a very easy and simple response, because in essence, I really don't know. And I say that because I leave my family every day and go out and risk my life for people I don't know. And that in and of itself, you know, I signed up, I wasn't drafted, you know, but that in and of itself is huge. And if there is an issue at my home, I can't even address it because I'm at work. And with everything going on, the pandemic, and I have 2 people in my home that are high risk. And so even going to work and coming home is a risk for them. When a police officer is killed in the line of duty, it is a blurb on the news. There is no outcry. There is little to no community support. And it's almost like, well, another cop gone, you know, but that takes a toll on law enforcement, and it heightens the awareness and enforcement level, if you will, when engaging people, because we just never know. Like, people often like to use the term, oh, this was a routine traffic stop or routine this or that. Nothing is routine in law enforcement. Nothing. I don't care if you've done it 1,000 times. It was different every single time. But the healing, I really don't know, you know, and I think it's incumbent upon every officer to find an outlet, because that is very important. But it's really hard. It's hard to heal in a society where the majority hates you, just about. You know, it's really difficult. You know, even if I have to stop on the way home to get milk, my wife is like, no, just come home, change, and then go back out, because I don't want anyone to see you in your uniform. And I'm kind of out here already, you know, but you just never know what's going on in another person's mind or what they've encountered in their day, you know, that may come back on me in that interaction. So when we talk about healing, you know, I'm a very spiritual person. I start every morning with Jesus, you know, that's who I believe in, and I post inspiration before my feet hit the ground. And that is my safe space. And then as soon as I'm often into my work, you know, we're bombarded with so many things. You know, you could see a shooting at 10 o'clock in the morning and a sexual assault at 12:30, and then a house fire, and then a robbery, and you never get a chance to decompress. You never get a chance to process all of these things. It was my old partner who was killed in a domestic violence incident by her boyfriend. Her birthday was yesterday. And having to work and knowing that her sister is now in the academy. Her mom just told me, you'll be teaching her Wednesday. Like all this is everything that I'm carrying in my head all the time, and still trying to be positive, be strong for my family and community, and push on. And it's almost as if, when do I even have time to heal? It never ends, you know, once you're in. And by me being a liaison for the department, I'm a Black woman, right, who's a law enforcement officer who is also gay. And so, like, I have all these different multitudes of hats that encompass who I am, and just constantly fighting and advocating for, you know, every component that is me. We don't kind of get a chance. We're not privy to healing. You know, we may get a break, maybe. And even in that break, you know, now you're taking care of home. So there are so many things. And so when you talk about trauma and the psyche of police officers, that is something that definitely needs to be addressed, because it's not. Because again, people don't view us as human. You know, it's like, you wear that uniform, so you're held to this standard, in which we are. But I can break a finger, if I cut my hand, I'm gonna bleed. You know, if I hit my head, I'll get a nugget, you know, all of these things. So I really struggle with that. And I've been going back and forth with, how do I answer that? Do I say a prayer? Do I say something just positive to get past it? But I thought that it would be a disservice to do that and not let you all know from this perspective that healing is almost imaginable.
Thank you so much, Liaison Woods. You've described what we need to do in terms of pulling back so many layers of a situation. It has so many dimensions, and we have to think about that. We have to think about it also for the community and individuals within the community. What does or can healing look like within our communities, Ms. Francis, with respect to police violence?
So I know I was asked a question about communities, and I promise I'm going to address that. And I have quick bullet points over here because I know we're over time. Before I do that, I just want to say, Liaison Woods, I am so respectfully to your wife in love with you right now. And the reason is because you've just role modeled vulnerability and healing. And I'm a fan, so if you need anything, let me know. And I also have hundreds of suggestions for officers, and I'm very proud of Wilmington. Starting in 2021, I will be one of their trainers. So I will kind of help them to deal with some of the things that you just illustrated. And I'm happy to do that all over the world. Okay, so communities, we need to do 4 things. One is we need to be honest with ourselves about where we are in terms of trauma. And that's an individual inventory, right? We're not pointing fingers and telling each other, oh, you're healed, you're not healed, you're here, you're there. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, in the privacy and safety of your home, your office, wherever you may be, take an inventory about where you truly are in terms of healing. Take an inventory about how you feel when you interact with an officer. Be honest with your body. Listen to your body and be honest with yourself. That's step number 1, because a lot of times we over-intellectualize things and we're not coming from a place of honesty. We're coming from a place of using fancy vocabularies and our fancy degrees. So that's number 1. Number 2, those of us who have the privilege of safety also need to engage in the privilege of healing, right? So let me say that one more time. Those of us that have the privilege of safety also need to engage in the privilege of healing. So for example, I feel safe in my home, which is where I currently am. So I also hold myself accountable for engaging in my own healing as a Black woman and what that means, which means every 2 weeks I go to therapy, because I need to be healthy in order to help other people be healthy, right? So I prioritize my self-care. Step number 3 is those of us who have the education, which a lot of us on this panel, all of us are highly educated, and our participants are giving some great feedback as well. So they are clearly highly educated as well. Is we need to make sure that we're making this information accessible to everyone, not only by holding wonderful Zoom sessions like we've had this evening, but also by using language that is accessible. I'm very much boots on the ground in my community, and one of the feedback I get from all people of all shapes and colors, but specifically Black men, is y'all just don't make sense to me. I don't understand what you're saying. So I stop listening. So a big part of a way that we can help by that is making sure that when we're talking to people, we're talking on their level in a way that they can understand. I think that's super critical, and we're being inclusive of everybody of all education levels. I think those are my things. You guys are amazing. I covered my 4 bullets, and I'm a huge, huge fan.
Thank you so much.
Yes, and we want to just um, make sure that we open this very spirited dialogue up to the community. I've been checking out the chat and it is just popping with reflections, with acknowledgement of the panelists, with some very thought-provoking questions. I'd like to introduce our current president of the New York Association of Black Psychologists, Dr. Dana Collins, who will support us in the next part of this forum, which is really engaging with the community questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Codrington. So I'm going to keep my remarks very brief out of respect for time for our wonderful panelists and, of course, all of you. I do want to, on behalf of the Association of Black Psychologists New York chapter, express deep gratitude. As everyone has alluded to tonight, policing is a complex issue, and there's not an individual, a family, or anyone in our community who it doesn't impact in some way. And finding solutions and making it work for us really does require much of what's happened tonight. Community, thought, conversation, and diverse perspectives, different perspectives. So with that, I do want to, I also want to acknowledge just very briefly that our president of the National Association, Dr. Theophia Jackson, has joined us tonight. No need to say anything, Dr. Jackson, I just did want to acknowledge you. It's always just a pleasure and an honor to have you. In terms of questions, so this is a question from Dr. Baytop, Donna Baytop, and it's in particular for psychologists. Stereotypes and implicit bias and preconceived notions about people in Black communities seems to be similar to descriptions in Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste: Origins of Our Discontent. So the question is the deep source of policing conflict racism? Is it really racism? Or is it an American caste system labeling groups of people as untouchables that need to be controlled?
Is the question for anyone?
Yes.
Oh, okay, I would like to tackle that because I think it is probably very similar to a caste system. It just played out in our country as racism because the slaves are members of a racial group that can be identified from generation to generation by color. Almost all other ethnic groups who came here were coming from oppressive circumstances themselves. The Polish, the Irish, the Italians and so forth. But what they were able to do in time was to integrate into the American culture, overall culture. But the system of slavery continued to view people of color, African Americans descendants, as second-class citizens. And that has been so ingrained in our cultural makeup over time that we have maintained that. And it looks like it may be only us, the African Americans ourselves, who are going to be able to overcome, that we can't rely on the establishment to overcome, not like it was in the 60s. We're going to have to do a lot of this ourselves. And then we'll have a caste system based upon riches, class, and race will no longer perhaps be an issue.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And you alluded to one of our Kwanzaa principles, self-determination. Are there others that have a response to that?
I would add that it's without a doubt that over-policing in minority communities have served to keep minorities in the ghetto. That's an historic fact. particularly in New York, uh, police officers were used to protect the property of the wealthy and to marginalize and keep at bay other ethnic minorities from Eastern European countries, from certainly the new immigrants. That was always the function of the police. That has not changed. No more so was it dramatized with the protesting and the targeting of businesses like Gucci, Prada, these name brand stores, Benetton's, and it was, that was the outcry. That was where the movement, so to speak, lost steam, because these businesses that a lot of people of color will patronize, that was the go-to. Let's go to Benetton's. Let's go to, what are some other stores? That was the target. The images of police officers standing back and allowing these businesses to be looted had a very interesting effect on the movement. And so I'm not going to share my personal opinions about that. However, with activism and the politics connected to it, it's a double-edged sword. To support anti-racism as a Black male, of course I do. To connect with an organization that might be viewed as being anti-American or Marxist or communist or socialist, and all these other expressions can really water down the focus of healing the Black community. I think our most targeted and best target are officers of color and their mental health, and the mental health of the communities of color. Because in that way, we can have a direct impact. And the messenger won't be shot down because we don't look like the individuals that we're helping.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that, Dr. Mack. And I think you make an excellent point about the importance of keeping a historical context in mind when we think about this and think about moving forward. So thank you so much for that. We'll do just one more question, again, in the interest of time and having time for our Kwanzaa celebration. We're going to go about 10 to 15 minutes over time. This has been, of course, a wonderful discussion, but we do hope that people are able to stay for the Kwanzaa celebration, which we'll have start very shortly. So this question comes from Dr. Lisa Witten, and it is related to something that has come up recently during this conversation about getting help for police, Black police in particular, because there is definitely a need when you think about the stressors and the trauma that comes with policing. So the question is, what is the best way to make Black officers aware of resources and help available for them? And I think in particular, given the stigma and maybe the reluctance and uncertainty to engage in help seeking.
I think if I'm not muted, okay, I'm not muted. I'll just defer certainly to Gregory Mack and others who can speak well to this, I'm sure, based on what they've already said. But certainly, like here in New York, there's the Guardians Association of Black officers. You want to certainly have a place for, I'm sure, where there's a platform for them to be able to share, have resources to be able to rely on each other. just as Officer Woods referred to, those day-to-day stressors, what is your release outlet, right? And sometimes it's another officer who understands what you yourself are going through, right? It may not be your husband or your wife, or because they're not similarly having the same issues out there in the field per se. The other thing that struck out to me as well, because I interviewed a lot of law enforcement sources, if you will, and when we talk about perceptions of community and where their mindset is, and you hate to paint a broad brush, certainly not doing that in answering this, but the reflective answer was to state what the current state of the crime rate is in that particular neighborhood, right? So if I'm interviewing them about the current state of policing, they instantly took me back to, well, now we're not doing as much policing anymore after the protests that have happened over the summer. And you had 100, I can read it off because I brought it here. There was 152 shootings in New York City this year compared to 67 last year. 51 homicides this year, 29 last year. Those were the statistics I was getting back from law enforcement. And again, whether the perception of whether our neighborhood should only be perceived through that funnel, what is happening in terms of the community police engagement, on a day-to-day basis, that didn't come up as much. And unfortunately, so there is a void, because ultimately to affect those numbers, and there is trauma behind those numbers as well, we can be clear and honest about that. The point is that these should not be diametrically opposed issues. The perception, as I found throughout all my years of reporting, that people who live in neighborhoods like East Flatbush, where I reside, that they don't want safe neighborhoods either, is one of the biggest misnomers.
Yes, of course. Yes.
Thank you for that. And I think you make a good point about how data can be used, information can be used. And of course, there are many kinds of data and different sources of information. Very, very important to remember. Could we have maybe just one other response to that? Ways of connecting Black officers with resources, or ways of making them aware of resources that are available to them?
So I just posted a link to the PAPA organization. 2 days ago, I got a phone call from the director of that organization, who had a peer support officer who was troubled because he had been on the front lines of the protesting. And as I recall, during the Crown Heights riots, being on the front lines of the protesting, you are confronted directly and personally, called the N-word, called an Uncle Tom, and spit on, spat at, personally attacked. And to maintain your composure, it takes a lot out of you. And so this officer was troubled. And so I had reached out to try to assist. However, I didn't get a call back. There's a ongoing stigma, and since the pandemic, I've been getting a lot of business. Let me just be frank. A lot of people are stressed. A lot of people are reaching out. On my website, I advertise being an officer of color. I put my picture up, and my phone is ringing off the hook. So the stigma is there. However, my putting that picture out with me in uniform has really increased my business. Almost so I might take the picture down because I'm getting overwhelmed with referrals. But the point I'm making is that I think when you put yourself out there with your picture, people will reach out, people will come. So the stigma is slowly being eradicated. It's happening referral after referral. It takes time, it's going to take a while, but I think, we can't lose sight of the fact that we're in a better place now, mental health wise, than we've ever been. There are more people reaching out now than they ever have, at least from my perspective, from what I can see, working with police officers. A lot of police officers are looking for help. And again, with the suicide, um, the number of suicides that have been occurring in recent times, this is prime time for mental health to get a spot in the sunlight. So that link that I put on the group chat, if you're interested, the director will love, he was thinking of putting up a panel specifically to target officers of color who are dealing with stress and during this time. Because it's one thing to be called names and the N-word by people who don't look like you, but when you're being targeted by people who do look like you, normally if you're called the N-word by someone that looks like you, we used to say it's okay. But when you're in this position, you quickly realize it's not. And it's painful and it hurts. And as an officer, there's nothing you can do. You're not supposed to act out. You're not supposed to respond. But as long as there's a beside and willing providers, these officers should have a place to go.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mack. One, thank you for the resources that you have shared. And I think you made an excellent point about the fact that even though there are still challenges in terms of Black officers getting help, we should celebrate the progress that has been made. We should not forget that. With that, we are going to begin our Kwanzaa celebration. Thank you all again, and I hope that people are able to stay for the Kwanzaa celebration.
Thank you, Dana.
Yes, thank you, Denise.
Kwanzaa is usually conducted as a joyful celebration. Then how does a panel discussion about policing in Black communities merge well with the celebration of Kwanzaa? There are 7 principles called the Nguzo Saba in Kiswahili, which are the backbone in the celebration of Kwanzaa. I present them to you here, merged with the theme of our panel discussion. Umoja, unity. Let us unite in our quest to improve policing tactics and methods within Black communities. Let us be a united effort from all sides to improve, protect, and to heal. Kujichagulia, self-determination. Let us determine our own needs within our own communities and work towards having more representation within a just and fair law enforcement agency that doesn't discriminate against us. Ujima, collective work and responsibility. Let us all do what we can do to work together towards a safe and harmonious community. Ujamaa, cooperative economics. We pay taxes for good policing, not to have our loved ones murdered. Why would we continue to pay for that? Police funding should pay for salaries as well as for programs to heal the communities. NIA, purpose. The purpose of policing in Black communities must be the healing, protecting, and guarding of Black lives. Stop killing Black people. Kuumba, creativity. In these days of blatant hate, divisiveness, COVID-19, and much uncertainty, we must find creative ways to come together, to work together, and together to build a new and beautiful existence, creating a model of what never was before. And faith, which is imani. We must have faith that policing in our communities can and will improve with unceasing effort and a vision of where each one sees themselves in the other. We will now move into a discussion about the elements of the Kwanzaa table and the significance of the Kwanzaa ceremony. When I was a young girl, I used to sing my own made-up lyrics to songs and melodies that I liked. I changed the song and made it my own according to what I needed and wanted in my life in order to energize and uplift me. That's what I love about Kwanzaa. Dr. Ron Karenga, or Mulana Master Teacher Karenga, created Kwanzaa in 1966 using elements of several African harvest celebrations and ceremonies, having it occur around the time of the year when celebratory energies were already high in the air, and when the habits of gift giving and platonic love was already associated by many during that time. So, in practicing Kwanzaa, we give handmade gifts and share talents and ideas to strengthen our people. Now, many of us who had celebrated Christmas don't feel we were giving up anything that we were familiar with. On the contrary, we were gaining. We were saving money needed for essentials by the family. We were sharing positive energies and talents with loved ones. We were contemplating helping concepts like those of the Nguzo Saba, also known as the 7 principles, that would take us to heightened levels of existence when practiced, and we were gaining self-respect. When something, even a holiday, is not working for you, you stop feeding it energies. You create and practice something else that does work for you. You stop waiting for things to change or begging for someone else to change them. You change them yourself. You create your own reality or your own holiday. We must create that change with our own thoughts, words, and deeds. We must be the change, be involved, and in the case of policing, we must make it work for us. Kwanzaa is the Kiswahili language word meaning first fruits or harvest. Kwanzaa is celebrated for 7 days, December 26th through January 1st each year, right after the winter solstice and Christmas. Here are the main symbols of Kwanzaa. Karamu means feast. Mazao are crops. Mkeka is the placemat where crops, fruits, and gifts are placed. Muhindi is an ear of corn representing fertility and the richness of children. Mishuma, they are the 7 candles, black, red, and green. Kinara is the candle holder representing our ancestors from where we came. Kikombe, cha, umoja, is the unity cup. On the 6th day of Kwanzaa, libations are poured from it. Ancestors are invoked, and we each drink from it, or this year have the drink from the cup poured into each one of our cups. And lastly, zawadi, which are gifts. On the 7th day, we give gifts to encourage growth, achievement, and success. Kwanzaa celebrations often include singing, dancing, storytelling, poetry reading, African drumming, and feasting. One of the 7 principles is discussed each day. Habari gani, someone may ask you. You must respond with the principle of the day. So if someone asks you that on the first day of Kwanzaa, your response would be umoja. Here are the 7 principles of the Nguzo Saba, the principles embodied by Kwanzaa, and each representing a candle to be lit in the Kinara. The lighting of the Mishuma Saba, or 7 candles, will begin now.
I will now light the black candle and the black.
Unity, to strive for and maintain unity in the family, community, nation, and the world. It represents oneness. It's all God.
And there are a variety of ways in which people move forward from here. Traditionally, the creator of Kwanzaa, Dr. Maulana Karenga, has advise that we light the red candles after the black, because the black represents the people, and then from the people come our struggle, which is represented by the red and the blood. And then without the struggle, we cannot progress and have a abundant future. And so oftentimes you'll see people light the black, then all of the red, and then all of the green. Tonight we will do an alternative, which is alternating between the red and the green candles, which is often practiced as well. I will now light the red candle for the second person.
Kujitakalea, self-determination, to define ourselves, name ourselves, create for ourselves, and speak for ourselves, instead of being defined, named, created for, and spoken for by others.
I will now light the third candle.
Ujima, collective work and responsibility, to build and maintain our community together and make our sisters and brothers' problems our own, and to solve them together.
I will now light the fourth candle.
Ujamaa, cooperative economics, to build and maintain our own stores, shops, and other businesses, and to profit from them together.
I will now light the fifth candle.
Nia, purpose, to make our collective vocation the building and developing of our community in order to restore our people to their traditional greatness.
I will now light the sixth candle.
Kuumba, creativity, to do always as much as we can in order to leave our community and world more beautiful and beneficial than when we inherited it.
I will now light our final seventh candle.
Imani, faith, to believe with all our hearts in our people, parents, teachers, leaders, and in the righteousness and victory of our united struggle. Thank you. After the Kwanzaa ceremony, Dr. Maulana Karenga suggested a farewell statement called the Tamishi La Tutaonana. I will share some of it with you. He said, strive for discipline, dedication, and achievement in all that you do. Dare to struggle and sacrifice and gain the strength that comes from this. Build where you are and dare to leave a legacy that will last as long as the sun shines and the water flows. And practice the Nguzo Saba, the 7 principles, daily. May the wisdom and love of our ancestors always be with us. May the yearnings and respect of those who come from us cheer us on into the future. Our ancestors and our progeny have their faith and hope in us and in what we do. Let us do all that we can and achieve greatness in this coming year. Let's pull together. Harambe means let's pull together. Together now, let's hold one of our hands up high, all of us together. And as we bring it down, clench it into a fist like you're pulling. As we do this, let's cry out, Harambe. This we'll do 7 times together.
And we're going to invite you to take yourselves off of mute.
Yes.
So that we can hear the collective strength in our community.
That's you. Thank you. Go. Harambe.
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 Harambe. The last one.
So we want to thank everyone. Thank you to Dr. Hines Zami for sharing such a beautiful introduction to Kwanzaa as well as personal reflections. We would love to be able to open up the floor for individuals to share a vision for how they think they would like to practice, sort of channel, enact any of the principles in this upcoming year of 2021, either in their individual life, their family life, their community life, or for our nation. We are running short on time, so instead of coming off mute, we will ask that you drop your thoughts and reflections in the chat, and then we will read them out and then come to a close.
NYAB Psi President Dr. Dana Collins will now close our event, but we invite you to stay for a few moments afterwards, just a few moments, for a very special tribute video. This video may make you cry or cheer or both.
Thank you all again to each and every one of our panelists and to each and every one of our community members for coming together with us tonight for our panel and for our Kwanzaa celebration. Dr. Codrington and Dr. Nzami, Dr. Nzami, I want to thank you for your creativity with putting together the Kwanzaa celebration and really elucidating how these principles are applicable not only during the time of Kwanzaa, but throughout the year and for so many different life situations. So thank you so much again. I want to invite all who are interested to join New York Association of Black Psychologists. In particular, I want to invite those who are interested to join our programming development and planning committee, which was responsible for putting the program together tonight. I'm going to include a link in the chat. And the programming development and planning committee is really important for putting events like this and other events together. So it's a very important and dear part of our organization. Thank you all. Have a good night. Take care.
Let us never forget who we were taken from, who was taken from us, helping to pave the way for our permanent uplift out of the ills of this world into our rightful place where the 7 principles and a healthy and happy resiliency are a part of our daily lives. Here is YouTube's tap dance video, Hell You Tell 'Em About.
Say his name. Say his name. Won't you say his name?
Freddie Gray, say his name. Freddie Gray, say his name. Freddie Gray, say his name. Freddie Gray, won't you say his name? Ayanna Jones, say her name. Ayanna Jones, say her name. Ayanna Jones, say her name. Ayanna Jones, won't you say her name? Sandra Bland, say her name. Sandra Bland, say her name. Sandra Bland, say her name. Sandra Bland, won't you say her name? Say her name. 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 Won't you say her name?
Kimani Gray, say his name. Kimani Gray, say his name. Kimani Gray, won't you say his name? John Crawford, say his name. John Crawford, say his name. John Crawford, say his name. John Crawford, won't you say his name? Michael Brown, say his name. Michael Brown, say his name. Michael Brown, say his name. Michael Brown, won't you say his name? Say his name. 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 Won't you say his name?
Miriam Carey, say her name. 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 Sharonda Singleton, say her name. Sharonda Singleton, say her name. Sharonda Singleton, say her name. Say her name. Say her name. Emmett Till, 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 say her name. Say his 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 name. What's the say his name?
Tommy Yancey, say his name. 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 Jordan Baker, say his name. Jordan Baker, say his name. Jordan Baker, say his name. Say his name, won't you say his name? I'ma Diallo, say his name. I'ma do Diallo, say his name. I'ma do Diallo, say his name. I'ma do Diallo, say his name. 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 Say his name.
George Floyd, say his name. George Floyd, say his name. George Floyd,
George Floyd.
say his
Say
name.
his name.
Say his
George
name.
name.
Say his
George
name.
Floyd.
Breonna Taylor, say her name.
Breonna
Breonna
Taylor.
Taylor.
Say her name. Breonna Taylor,
Anthony
say her name.
Baez.
Say her name. Say her name. To all of our loved ones, we honor you. We salute you. Thank you all.
Thank you all for
Thank
joining
you.
us. Have a blessed and prosperous and safe and loving holiday season and new year. And we will see you in 2021.
Thank you.
you.